December 1944. A cold wind swept across the compound of Camp Swift, Texas, carrying the smell of boiled coffee and bread fresh from industrial ovens. Behind barbed wire, a column of captured German soldiers stood in rigid silence, their faces drawn with fatigue and disbelief. They had crossed the Atlantic in cramped holds, convinced by propaganda that captivity in America meant starvation and humiliation. But what they saw instead stunned them. Rows of American soldiers filed through the mess hall, laughing, trays heavy with meat, vegetables, and thick slices of pie. In the next line, guards gestured to the newcomers, "Essen, eat." Hesitantly, the Germans approached. Stainless steel trays clattered. Hot stew, cornbread, and something unfamiliar, a brown square wrapped in foil, chocolate. One prisoner smirked, muttering a joke about decadent Americans. Others chuckled weakly, but when they bit into it, the laughter faded. Silence fell over the table. The taste of sugar and cocoa carried more shock than any weapon they had faced on the battlefield. In that moment, captivity began to mean something very different. By late 1943, the tide of war was turning. The Allied advance in North Africa and Italy had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. Among them were veterans from the Afrika Korps and divisions of the Wehrmacht, who had once believed they would never be taken alive. When surrender came, it came quietly, men exhausted, uniforms torn, discipline replaced by survival instinct. For most, captivity meant uncertainty. German propaganda had painted a dark picture of the enemy. Leaflets distributed to frontline units described the Americans as decadent, materialistic and cruel. Soldiers were warned that if captured, they would be starved or executed. The image of the soft American who relied on machines rather than courage had been repeated so often that it had become doctrine. Yet, behind the front lines, the United States was preparing for something few Germans could have imagined, a vast, organized network of prisoner-of-war camps that followed international law with near-surgical precision. By the end of 1944, over 400,000 German POWs were held across the United States, scattered from Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to California. These camps were not hidden or brutal. They were constructed near military bases and agricultural centers, designed to keep men occupied and productive while maintaining humane conditions. Each camp operated under the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required fair treatment, adequate food and medical care. The United States, aware of its image on the world stage, chose to uphold these standards meticulously. Feeding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers posed a massive logistical challenge. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps took the task personally. If American troops ate well, so would their prisoners. That was the rule. Each German received 3 full meals per day, built on the same caloric standards as U.S. soldiers: meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, and occasionally desserts or fruit. Food became a quiet weapon of ideology, one that undermined Nazi claims of American corruption. In Germany, rationing had long reduced civilian diets to the edge of hunger. Soldiers at the front were accustomed to watery soups, dry bread, and ersatz coffee brewed from barley or acorns. Butter was a memory. Meat was rationed to grams, not portions. Even in occupied territories, German troops faced shortages that gnawed at morale. So when captured men saw steaming plates of food handed to them by their enemies, confusion set in. "It cannot be true," one prisoner later wrote in a letter to his wife. "They eat like kings. Even we, their prisoners, are fed better than our soldiers at the front." Many officers suspected it was a trick, propaganda to break their pride. Some refused to eat at first, testing the boundaries of dignity. But hunger and reality soon dissolved defiance. Within days, even the most hardened veterans lined up at the mess hall, trays in hand, watching American cooks in white aprons ladle food with practiced precision. The American mess line became a stage for psychological warfare, not through violence but through abundance. To a generation raised on scarcity and obedience, the sight of American soldiers eating freely, laughing, and leaving food unfinished was almost incomprehensible. Here waste was a symbol of plenty, generosity, a weapon sharper than steel. Letters intercepted by camp censors revealed an emotional undercurrent. Some prisoners wrote home with disbelief, describing meals of beef stew and potatoes, or the sweetness of canned fruit. "If this is the enemy," one man confessed, "then the enemy has more humanity than our leaders ever told us." Others grew silent, their loyalty to the Reich quietly eroding under the weight of kindness. The story of food in captivity was not just about hunger. It was about ideology collapsing under the simplest proof. Every loaf of bread, every chocolate bar, every clean utensil served a purpose. It wasn't meant to humiliate the enemy. It was meant to remind them that civilization could survive even in war. And yet, this revelation was only beginning. For many German POWs, the greatest shock was still to come, when they discovered why the Americans could feed them so well, and how the system behind it reflected an entirely different philosophy of warfare. The journey from the European battlefields to the American heartland was as surreal as the surrender itself. After capture, German soldiers were processed in Allied collection points in North Africa, Italy, and later in Normandy. From there they were loaded onto Liberty ships and troop transports bound for the United States. Each ship carried hundreds of prisoners, guarded by U.S. military police and Red Cross observers. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks. The men slept in hammocks stacked 3 high, ate meals of beans, bread and stewed vegetables, and endured the constant fear of U-boat attacks from their own navy. Many later said that the moment the ship reached New York Harbor or New Orleans was the first time they truly felt the war was over for them. The skyline, the noise, and the sight of well-fed civilians walking freely struck them harder than any battlefield defeat. Once disembarked, the prisoners were sent by rail to camps across the country. The trains rolled through vast landscapes that none of them had imagined, endless fields, busy towns, children waving from platforms. It was not the enemy homeland they had been told to expect. "If this is how their civilians live," one captured officer wrote in a camp diary, "then everything we were told in Germany was a lie." When they reached the camps, the first encounter with American orderliness left a lasting impression. Each compound was a miniature city, barracks lined in rows, watchtowers at corners, recreation fields, mess halls, libraries, and even chapels. Life was organized to prevent idleness. German officers were separated from enlisted men, political indoctrinators were quietly removed. The rest were encouraged to study, work, or assist in local agriculture. Then came the moment that many would remember for the rest of their lives, the first meal on American soil. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, survivors recalled the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread drifting through the air. At Camp Grant in Illinois, the guards handed out milk, fruit, and pie. It was not luxury by American standards, but for men who had been living on thin soup and ration crumbs, it felt impossible. The menu followed precise U.S. Army regulations. A typical meal consisted of beef or pork, boiled potatoes, vegetables, white bread, butter, and coffee. Prisoners even received sugar, something Germans had not seen in years. Once a week, dessert was served, pudding, cake, or chocolate bars from military stock. To the Americans, This was standard rationing. To the Germans, it was a revelation. The contrast between propaganda and reality became evident almost immediately. Nazi indoctrination had taught them that America was weak, racially divided, and morally corrupt, a nation of machine operators with no discipline. Yet, in the camps they saw efficiency without brutality, discipline without cruelty. Guards addressed them formally, medical staff treated their wounds, and chaplains visited regularly. When a prisoner died, he was buried with a wooden cross, his name carved neatly into it. Many prisoners could not reconcile what they saw with what they had believed. It was as if the world had been turned upside down, wrote a former corporal after the war. We were the defeated, yet they treated us with more respect than our own officers. American generosity was not driven purely by compassion. It was strategy, a moral mirror to Nazi barbarity. Washington knew that every German prisoner who returned home after the war would carry stories of how they had been treated. Those stories would undermine the myths that sustained the Reich. The US understood that victory was not only won on battlefields, but also in hearts and minds. Food became a quiet ambassador of that policy. Every ration served was a message. This is what freedom produces. To German eyes, even the waste, soldiers leaving food unfinished, was a display of unimaginable abundance. In the evenings, as prisoners gathered in the barracks, conversations would drift back to home. They compared what they ate that day to what their families might be enduring under Allied bombing and rationing. Some felt guilt, others, gratitude. Letters sent back to Germany often carried coded hints. We are treated fairly, we do not starve. By the time 1945 arrived, the shock had begun to settle into understanding. The war had stripped them of pride, but captivity introduced them to something they had never been allowed to question, the idea that humanity could exist on both sides of a wire fence. And yet, the most striking transformation wasn't in the camp's routines or the guards' discipline. It happened at a table where laughter, mockery, and disbelief would melt into silence with a single bite of chocolate. Behind the wire, life settled into rhythm. Roll call, work detail, meals, rest, yet beneath the quiet order of camp routine, an invisible transformation was taking place. The German prisoners who had arrived with rigid posture and cold discipline began to change, not through force, but through exposure to a different way of living. Many of them had been raised in a culture where loyalty and obedience overshadowed individuality. The Nazi state had conditioned soldiers to believe that compassion was weakness and that mercy toward the enemy was treason. But the war's endgame and American captivity challenged that belief system daily. The first shock came from the guards. Most were young Americans, barely older than the prisoners themselves. They were not brutal, not even particularly hostile. They followed orders, but they smiled, joked, and treated the prisoners as men rather than enemies. When one guard offered a cigarette to a captured corporal, the German hesitated before taking it, unsure if it was a trick. The simple gesture, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of camps, began eroding the wall of propaganda brick by brick. Then came the work assignments. Prisoners were sent to nearby farms to assist in harvests, construction, or maintenance. They were paid a small wage in camp coupons, which they could use at canteens to buy toiletries, magazines, or snacks, including American chocolate. For many, this was the first time they had handled commerce outside the control of the state. Some sent savings home through Red Cross intermediaries. Others used them to buy cigarettes or canned fruit, luxuries they hadn't known in years. The most profound change, however, occurred around the dinner table. Food served in stainless steel trays became a daily ceremony that reminded them of what they had lost. Not only the war, but also the idea of trust. At first, they mocked the portions, sneering at dishes drowned in gravy or meat they considered soft. One prisoner wrote that the Americans ate like spoiled children, too much, too often. But he later added, "It was envy that made us laugh." Gradually, laughter turned to silence. They began to notice small things, the aroma of fresh coffee in the morning, the taste of butter, the crispness of lettuce, the sweetness of jam. To a man who had lived on dry rations in the Russian steppe or the Tunisian desert, these sensations were overwhelming. The body remembered what comfort felt like, even if the mind resisted. Some prisoners started keeping notebooks, describing every meal in detail, the number of eggs, the texture of bread, the brand of chocolate. Decades later, historians would find these notes in archives, often smudged and worn, proof of how deeply food had imprinted on memory. Human psychology shifted with each bite. The propaganda image of the decadent American no longer fit the evidence. How could a nation capable of such logistical abundance and respect for its captives be weak? Even those who remained loyal to Hitler privately admitted that the American system functioned with efficiency that rivaled Germany's, but without the cruelty. Interactions between prisoners and local civilians further softened the edges. On farms, German workers were sometimes invited to share lunch with American families. They saw children who were well fed, women who managed households with ease, and communities unscarred by bombings. It was as if we had stepped into another world, one former Luftwaffe mechanic recalled. Everything worked, everyone smiled, and there was food everywhere. The emotional contrast was staggering. In Germany, cities lay in ruins, families scavenged for scraps amid rubble. Letters from home carried desperate lines, "There is nothing to eat," or "Your mother trades furniture for bread." Yet the prisoners ate 3 times a day, their plates full. The guilt that followed was heavy, and many found solace in prayer or quiet reflection. In that strange balance between shame and gratitude, respect grew. The Americans had not tried to humiliate them with luxury. They had simply shown them that humanity could coexist with victory. Every meal was a lesson in values, discipline without cruelty, abundance without arrogance, mercy without weakness. And while not every man was changed by it, thousands were. Their worldview, once forged in ideology and fire, was now reshaped by something as ordinary, as profoundly simple, as food. But there was more than just humanity at work here. Behind the calm of daily meals lay an immense, precise machine, a logistical operation unlike anything Germany could sustain by 1944. The story of that system, and how it became a silent weapon of psychological warfare, is the next angle to explore. Behind the quiet ritual of daily meals was one of the most complex logistical systems of the entire war, the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps. Its mission was not only to feed millions of American troops scattered across the globe, but also to sustain hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners held inside the United States. It was an operation of staggering precision. Every calorie was accounted for, every ration balanced according to the standards of the Army Regulation 850 TAPIS 15, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war. The rule was simple and absolute: enemy prisoners shall receive the same rations as American soldiers. This was not a moral flourish. It was strategy. The War Department understood that a soldier's behavior in captivity could ripple across the front lines. If captured Americans were treated well, It was partly because their nation treated its own captives well. It was reciprocity wrapped in ethics, and it worked. Reports from Europe indicated that German officers, aware of their men's humane treatment overseas, began curbing abuses toward Allied POW. Supplying such abundance required an industrial rhythm that few nations could match. The United States possessed what wartime economists called the arsenal of logistics. Trains brought wheat from Kansas, beef from Texas, coffee from Brazil, and sugar from Louisiana to massive depots run by the Quartermaster Corps. From there, shipments radiated outward to military bases and POW camps in every state. Each camp had its own kitchen infrastructure, vast dining halls, refrigeration units, and bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves a day. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, ovens ran nearly 24 hours. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, prisoners worked alongside American cooks, learning to prepare meals according to U.S. standards. Sanitation was enforced with military precision, food waste was minimal, menus were posted publicly, and inspections were routine. One of the most remarkable elements of this system was the chocolate ration D-bar, a creation of science and morale combined. Originally designed in 1937 by Hershey's for the U.S. Army, it was intended as a compact, high-calorie emergency food, resistant to melting, easy to store, and dense enough to sustain soldiers in combat. It was not sweet like a normal candy bar, it was functional, almost bitter. But in POW camps, a different kind of chocolate, surplus civilian bars and Red Cross parcels often appeared in canteens and special meals. For the Germans, chocolate symbolized something beyond taste. During the war, it had become rare even for civilians. The Reich had diverted cocoa imports to military use, and substitutes were common. When a German prisoner unwrapped a real American bar, rich, creamy, and whole, it represented not just flavor but power. It was the physical proof of what industrial abundance could achieve when it wasn't consumed by ideology. The Americans knew this. Commanders allowed limited access to sweets and soft foods precisely because they had a psychological effect. A warm meal, clean utensils, and the unexpected taste of chocolate all communicated one message: you are defeated, but you are not dehumanized. Even the design of the mess halls carried intent. Long communal tables replaced the rigid formations of the German military. Prisoners sat facing one another, free to talk quietly. Posters on the walls displayed Red Cross rules in German. Hygiene officers, many of them medical professionals, inspected every surface. The environment was one of order, but not oppression. This calm efficiency left an impression that went far beyond comfort. It demonstrated the sheer scale of American organization, a system that could fight a war on two oceans and still feed its enemies properly. German officers noted it in their diaries. Their strength is in their system. They believe in the machine, but it serves the man, not the other way around. To the US, the logistical perfection of its food supply was both necessity and statement. It proved that democracy could outproduce dictatorship without sacrificing humanity. In the same period that German cities starved and factories collapsed under bombing raids, American supply lines ran with mechanical certainty. This unseen angle, the industrial and moral backbone of feeding the enemy, became one of the most potent symbols of Allied superiority. And soon that symbol would come alive in a single unforgettable moment, when the mockery ended and the taste of chocolate silenced the room. It happened in the spring of 1945, at a camp in the American Midwest, one of hundreds scattered across the heartland. The war in Europe was nearing its end. News of Allied advances reached the prisoners through guarded whispers, Red Cross bulletins, and the expressions of American soldiers who no longer seemed tense. The men behind the wire sensed the shift long before Berlin fell. By now, routine had dulled the edge of captivity. The prisoners rose at dawn, marched to roll call and lined up in the mess hall, their boots crunching on gravel paths. The once proud discipline of the Wehrmacht had softened into weary acceptance. The guards had stopped shouting commands. They no longer needed to dat. That morning began like any other. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the air as the camp loudspeaker crackled to life with a weather report. The kitchen staff, a mix of American cooks and a few German helpers, moved with practiced rhythm. Pots of stew simmered on industrial burners, trays of bread cooled on metal racks, and boxes of rations were stacked neatly by the service line. When the prisoners filed in, they found something unusual on their trays, a small foil-wrapped square resting beside the bread. It glinted under the fluorescent light, unfamiliar and strangely elegant. For a moment, no one touched it. Then one of the younger men, a radio operator from Bremen, picked it up and turned it over in his fingers. "Amerikanische Schokolade," he muttered, drawing a few laughs from the table. Mockery came easily. They had been taught to sneer at American indulgence, to see sweetness as a symbol of weakness. One prisoner joked that the Americans were trying to make them soft before interrogation. Another called it women's food. Even so, curiosity lingered. When the first man bit into it, the reaction was almost physical. The texture, the smoothness, the immediate rush of sugar, it was a sensation most had forgotten. For men raised in rationing and scarcity, it was like tasting another world. The laughter died, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any order. Witnesses later recalled that moment vividly. Some stared at the chocolate in disbelief. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite as though afraid it might vanish. "We had not tasted real chocolate since before the war," one prisoner wrote years later. "For a few seconds I forgot the wire, the guards, everything. I was simply human again." That silence spread through the room like a wave. Even the guards seemed to sense it. No one spoke. Trays clattered softly, spoons scraped against metal, but the usual noise of mealtime, jokes, orders, clinking cups, had disappeared. It wasn't surrender, nor humiliation. It was realization. In that instant, propaganda cracked. For years these men had been told that the United States was a country of chaos and moral decay, where greed ruled and strength meant nothing. Yet the evidence sat melting on their tongues. A nation capable of fighting across 2 oceans and still producing enough to feed even its enemies, that was not weakness. That was power of a different kind. Later that day, in the yard, conversations changed. Some prisoners confessed their surprise openly, others defended the Reich half-heartedly, but the doubt was there. A few even wondered aloud what life might be like in such a country, where order came without fear and abundance didn't demand cruelty. American officers didn't lecture them. They didn't need to. Every detail of daily life did the talking: the clean uniforms, the punctual deliveries, the calm authority of men who didn't shout to prove control. One camp psychologist later noted that a single meal did more to dismantle enemy pride than weeks of interrogation. As days passed, chocolate became more than a dessert. It was traded, saved, shared, even offered as gifts to guards during holidays. Some prisoners sent pieces home in letters to show their families what the enemy looked like, not in photographs, but in taste. For the Americans, it was routine, nothing remarkable. For the Germans, it was revelation, a small edible piece of freedom, wrapped in silver paper. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Chocolate had been one of the first luxuries to vanish from Germany's civilian shelves as the war dragged on. By 1944, it existed only in memory, reserved for propaganda films showing happy Aryan families that no longer existed. To taste it, again in captivity, was to confront the truth that their nation, once feared for its efficiency, had been outmatched by one that valued comfort as much as conquest. That single bite did not end the war, but it ended an illusion. Pride gave way to introspection. Many prisoners began keeping diaries, not of battles or losses, but of food, the bread, the coffee, the strange generosity of an enemy who could afford to be kind. The moment would echo long after the war's end, carried in memories and letters that returned across the Atlantic. For the Americans, it was a simple act of procedure. For the Germans, it was the taste of defeat and of rediscovered humanity. And yet, the true turning point went beyond emotion. It reached into the structure of power itself, revealing what separated a collapsing empire from a thriving democracy. The following months inside those camps would show how this quiet revelation began to reshape loyalty, identity, and even the future of a nation, learning what it truly meant to lose. In the weeks that followed that quiet mealtime revelation, something began to shift deep inside the barbed wire fences. It wasn't sudden or visible, but it was real, a change in the air, in the tone of conversations, in the way German prisoners looked at their captors. The laughter that once filled the barracks at night began to fade, replaced by a reflective silence. Some men still clung to old pride, repeating that their homeland would rise again, that Hitler had secret weapons, that the Reich would endure. But others listened less. The camp had become a world where the strength of America was no longer abstract. It was seen, felt, and tasted every single day. What struck them most was not the food itself, but the normalcy of it. Meals arrived on time. Bread was never moldy, coffee was always hot. The American guards, though watchful, ate the same rations beside them. No shouting, no favoritism, no chaos, just order born from confidence. It was discipline without brutality, structure without oppression. To men who had grown up under Nazi command, where fear was the engine of control, this quiet efficiency was disarming. They began to respect it, even admire it. Some prisoners took pride in the work they were assigned, running the camp gardens, repairing tools, helping in kitchens. When local farmers requested POW labor to help with harvests, many volunteered, curious to see the American countryside beyond the wire. What they saw there broke every image they had been taught. Families invited them to lunch. Children waved. Women handed them sandwiches and lemonade, even though these were the same men who had once fought under a banner that sought to dominate the world. We could not understand such behavior, one former prisoner Hans Reimer later recalled. They had every reason to hate us, yet they treated us as men. That summer something remarkable began happening in several camps. German choirs formed, performing hymns and folk songs on Sunday afternoons. American officers often stood by quietly, listening. The hostility that once defined captivity had dissolved into routine coexistence. In some places, prisoners and guards even held soccer matches together, competitive, loud but friendly. The war, though not yet officially over, had already ended in spirit behind the wire. And still, the chocolate lingered in memory. Prisoners joked about it, traded it, even used it as currency. When a new shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived containing small bars, they were guarded like treasure. Some men saved them for Christmas. Others mailed them home to their families with notes. "You will not believe this, they give us chocolate." American intelligence officers noticed this transformation. reports from camp administrators to the War Department spoke of increasingly cooperative attitudes among German POWs. The hostility that had marked the early months of captivity was almost gone. The men worked better, caused fewer disturbances, and even reported Nazi agitators in their own ranks. The US government understood the quiet power of this development. Psychological warfare experts began referring to it as the human approach, the belief that treating prisoners with fairness could erode totalitarian conditioning more effectively than interrogation. The results were visible. When news arrived of Germany's surrender in May 1945, many POWs did not celebrate or mourn. They simply sat in silence, staring at the ground, the realization of total defeat finally sinking in. In that silence, something else emerged: humility. Not the humiliation of the battlefield, but a kind that comes from recognizing what one has misunderstood. One camp commander recorded in his journal, "They no longer speak of superiority. Now they ask questions about elections, about our schools, about freedom." After Germany's surrender, some prisoners expected punishment or retribution. Instead, they found the rules largely unchanged. The meals continued, the chocolate sometimes appeared on Sundays, letters were allowed. Some camps even hosted lectures on democracy, literature and history. American officers encouraged the prisoners to think about rebuilding their country one day, not with weapons but with ideas. For many, these words were difficult to accept. They had been taught that defeat meant annihilation. Yet what they experienced felt different. It was not vengeance. It was reconstruction in its earliest, most personal form. The lesson was subtle. A nation's true power did not come from how it destroyed its enemies, but how it treated them afterward. Years later, historians would trace a connection between these POW experiences and the post-war transformation of Germany. When thousands of these men returned home between 1946 and 1947, they carried stories that contradicted everything their people had been told. They spoke of order, abundance, respect, and chocolate. Those stories mattered. They seeded a quiet admiration for the democracy they had once despised. In small towns across Germany, returned soldiers told children about clean camps, fair treatment, and food that never ran out. Many refused to rejoin extremist groups. Some even returned to America after the war, drawn by memories that no propaganda could erase. At its core, this turning point was not about sweetness or generosity, it was about identity. The Germans who laughed at American food had been taught that compassion was weakness. In captivity, they learned it was strength, and while barbed wire still surrounded them, it no longer defined them. The fences remained, but inside, something had shifted permanently. They had tasted not just chocolate, but the quiet taste of freedom, and it was enough to change how they saw the world. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners remained in American camps. The guns fell silent, but life behind the wire continued with calm regularity. For many, the surrender did not bring immediate freedom. The camps still stood, the rules still applied, and the routine still ran with clockwork precision. Yet everything felt different. The tension that had once pressed on every interaction slowly dissolved. The guards, no longer preparing for new arrivals, relaxed. The prisoners, no longer clinging to news from the front, began to think about what came next: home, family, rebuilding, and survival. Reports from camp inspectors painted a consistent picture. Discipline remained high, morale steady, and cooperation improving. In many camps, German officers who once refused to work began volunteering for assignments. Others organized study circles, language classes, and agricultural projects. The same men who had arrived, convinced of the Reich's eternal rule, now read English newspapers, learned American slang, and debated politics in evening discussions. Food remained central to their existence, both as comfort and as symbol. Meals continued according to U.S. Army regulations, generous portions, clean facilities, and variety unheard of in war-torn Europe. Red Cross parcels supplemented the diet, often containing the same small treasures that had first disarmed their pride: cigarettes, canned fruit, and chocolate bars. Letters home, carefully censored but deeply revealing, carried fragments of gratitude. "We are treated fairly," one man wrote to his wife in Dresden. "There is enough to eat, and they even give us sweets. Tell our son not to hate the Americans. They are not what we were told." American authorities understood the influence of such messages. They encouraged honesty within limits, knowing that these letters would circulate among families and communities back in Germany. Each word written from captivity became a quiet ambassador for democracy, a human contrast to the regime that had crumbled in ruins. Some prisoners expressed guilt. They knew their families were starving under occupation and ruin, while they, the defeated soldiers, ate well. "It is strange to feel both lucky and ashamed," wrote one former tank gunner. "We fought for a cause that destroyed our people. Here, our enemy feeds us." That contradiction haunted many. In the broader American consciousness, these camps were mostly invisible. The war effort had been vast, and by 1945, the nation turned its attention toward victory in the Pacific. Few civilians outside nearby towns ever interacted with the prisoners. Those who did often came away surprised. Farmers who employed POW labor during harvest seasons described the men as hard-working and disciplined. Some even exchanged small gifts or letters after the war. "They were not monsters," one farmer's wife later recalled. "They were just boys, hungry and far from home." For the prisoners, these encounters broke another myth. The enemy was not faceless anymore. It had kindness, laughter, and patience. To many, the greatest culture shock was not technological, but moral. Realizing that America's strength came from stability, not fear. As summer turned to autumn, camp life became quieter. The sound of trains still echoed through the distance, some carrying soldiers home, others moving supplies, but within the fences, a strange peace settled. Choirs sang hymns of hope. Workshops produced wooden carvings, paintings, and model ships. Some men carved tiny boxes from scrap wood to hold small bars of chocolate, souvenirs of the day. Everything changed. By the end of 1945, inspectors from the International Red Cross praised the United States for maintaining standards exceeding those required by the Geneva Convention. The report noted that German prisoners appeared healthier on average than when captured, with mortality rates near zero. It was an extraordinary achievement in a world still reeling from war's destruction. But beyond health and efficiency, something less tangible had taken root: respect. The Germans had learned to see their captors not as enemies, but as examples. That realization, born from daily routine and simple decency, would echo long after they were gone. Yet the story didn't end when the fences finally opened. The most profound impact of these camps would unfold only later, when the men returned to a devastated homeland, carrying with them memories of order, generosity, and a small piece of sweetness they could never forget. Repatriation began slowly. In 1946, with Europe in ruins and Germany divided among the Allied powers, the United States started returning its prisoners in large waves. Trainloads of men departed from the camps that had defined their post-war lives, Texas, Iowa, Georgia, and California, and made their way to ports along the East Coast. From there, liberty ships carried them across the Atlantic once more, though this time the journey was calm, the seas free of fear. For many prisoners, leaving America felt strangely bittersweet. They were eager to see their families, yet reluctant to abandon the stability that had shaped their captivity. One man wrote in his final letter before departure, "We came here as enemies, but we leave as witnesses." When these men stepped back onto German soil, the contrast was devastating. Cities lay in ashes, the air still carried the smell of smoke and dust. Food was scarce, power unreliable, and winter came hard. Families scavenged through rubble for anything edible. Those who had been prisoners in America returned to find themselves envied, not pitied. They were healthy, well-fed, and clean. Some wore American denim work clothes or carried Red Cross parcels that still smelled faintly of coffee and soap. It was not unusual for returnees to be questioned about their experiences. Neighbors, skeptical at first, listened as they described the order and humanity of the camps, the regular meals, the warmth of the guards, the taste of chocolate. "You lie," some replied. "They would never treat you so well." But soon, as similar stories spread, disbelief gave way to curiosity and then quiet admiration. Historians later referred to this period as the beginning of reorientation. It was not a formal policy yet, but the seeds of post-war democratization were already being planted, not by politicians, but by men who had once been soldiers of a dictatorship. In beer halls and kitchens across the ruined towns, they shared the same refrain: "The Americans are not like we were told." For some, these memories shaped their future. Former POWs found work with U.S. occupation authorities, translating, assisting, rebuilding. Others became teachers or engineers in the new West Germany, carrying with them a sense of order and fairness they had first observed behind American fences. A few even emigrated back to the United States in later years, seeking the land that had once held them captive. Psychologists studying these men decades later noted that the experience of humane captivity had long-lasting effects. It eroded fanaticism more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The moral lesson absorbed in the camps, that strength could coexist with decency, became part of the foundation upon which post-war reconciliation was built. The story of food remained central in their recollections. At reunions and interviews, former prisoners rarely spoke first of guards or fences, they spoke of meals. "I remember the first time I held a cup of hot coffee," said one. "It felt like forgiveness." Another recalled a Thanksgiving dinner prepared by local volunteers. "We did not know the word, but we felt its meaning." The chocolate bar, once a momentary curiosity, became legend. Many kept the wrappers folded carefully among their belongings for decades. It symbolized the day when hate gave way to humility, when propaganda melted faster than the foil it was wrapped in. For America, the POW experience became a quiet success story, rarely publicized but deeply influential. It demonstrated that moral power, the ability to uphold principles even toward enemies, could outlast military might. When the U.S. entered the Cold War years, those lessons carried forward into new conflicts and new debates about justice, treatment, and human dignity. By 1947, the last large groups of German POWs left American soil. The camps were dismantled, barracks converted into storage or housing. Grass grew over parade grounds where men had once marched. In small towns across the Midwest and South, memories lingered of orderly columns of foreign soldiers, of laughter from soccer fields, and of the polite nods exchanged between guard and prisoner. For the men who sailed home, America was no longer an enemy, it was a mirror reflecting what their own nation had lost. Years later, when asked what they remembered most, their answers rarely spoke of fear or hardship. Instead, they mentioned kindness, routine, and the taste of something they had never forgotten. Chocolate, one said simply. It was only a piece of candy, but in that moment it tasted like peace. History often records wars through fire, the cities destroyed, the armies moved, the battles won and lost. But sometimes the truest measure of victory lies not in what a nation conquers, but in what it refuses to abandon. For the United States, the decision to treat German prisoners with fairness was not just compliance with the Geneva Convention, it was a declaration of identity. It said to the world, and to the prisoners themselves, that democracy's strength was rooted not in fear, but in restraint. To feed the enemy, to give them coffee, bread, and even chocolate, was to prove that civilization could survive the brutality of global conflict. For the Germans who lived through that experience, the lesson endured long after the fences came down. They had seen two systems up close, one built on obedience, the other on trust. And in the quiet order of those camps, they discovered that the power they had once worshipped in Berlin paled beside the quiet confidence of their captors. The chocolate bar, simple and unremarkable in appearance, became a symbol of this transformation. It carried no political slogan, no speech, no banner, only the weight of decency wrapped in silver foil. It silenced mockery, softened anger, and reminded men hardened by war that humanity could still reach across the lines drawn by ideology. Decades later, when historians interviewed former POWs, many spoke not of their capture or interrogation, but of their first meal in America. The warmth of the bread, the kindness of the guards, the taste of chocolate melting on the tongue. It was, to them, the moment the war truly ended. Every conflict leaves behind ruins, but among the ruins, some fragments endure, fragments of mercy, order, and memory. In those American camps, behind barbed wire and under watchtowers, something deeply human survived the war intact. And for thousands of men who came as soldiers and left as witnesses, the lesson was eternal. Strength without compassion breeds tyranny, but compassion guided by strength can rebuild a world.